Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. You might be thinking, gosh, 2 podcasts in 2 days. What on earth is happening here? Well, if you're not thinking that, it's probably because you're not subscribed to the podcast, because periodically in my podcast feeds, and this is most of my podcasts, I put out bonus podcasts that are only available in the RSS feed. So one of the benefits to actually subscribe to the podcast formally is that you will get additional content that isn't quite to the level of an actual episode, but I still decide to throw in there just to give some updates and these kind of things. So certainly, if you want 2 recordings in 2 days and you haven't seen the second recording, please subscribe to the podcast. Reviews on iTunes are also nice. My wife pointed out I don't push this enough. I don't tell people, write reviews on iTunes, but probably writing reviews on iTunes might be beneficial as well. I've got a number of topics to discuss today, actually. Spoilt for topics. This is what recording a podcast does. It kind of puts your mind back and thinks, gee, I actually have a lot of topics here. But one of these things came up perfectly by accident. My wife and I have been doing a variety of things in a variety of different areas, and we're just looking for a reason to kind of collapse on the couch and watch an old movie. And I floated a few movie titles, but then we realized that iTunes was having a special on the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I wouldn't really rate the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the books, let's just be honest here. I read the books because you have to do it. It's just what nerds have to do. Wasn't a huge fan of the books. I mean, Tolkien as a character, as a person, is actually far more fascinating than his books are as things. But anyway, that is an aside. So we sat down to Fellowship of the Rings. We watched about half of it. We'll watch probably the remaining half this evening. I do advise doing that, actually, dividing these 3-hour movies into 1.5-hour movies, and you get more bang for your buck, fundamentally. Anyway, in watching it, I realized that this movie had a number of different things that were quite important to me. And aside, when my wife and I first watched the movie, we also, I think in a similar time frame, went to Warhammer World in Nottingham. And I bought a set of figures for my wife, which were the Fellowship of the Ring's good characters, and sent them off to my painter at the time, a gentleman by the name of Fred Reed, or Justin Reed, as his legal name is. And he must have painted probably about 800 figures for me over the time that we were in the UK, give or take a few. And he couldn't paint the Lord of the Rings figures. They were just not a style that he could paint, and he ended up not ever sending them back. So it was a kind of strange thing in our marriage for years, that while I was getting, kind of monthly cases of painted miniatures, my wife would never get her miniatures back. And Games Workshop recently redid the metal figures for Fellowship of the Rings. I picked them up, I have them ready, can have them professionally painted, and then I'll present them to my wife. Anyway, this is not the reason I'm recording this podcast. The reason I'm recording this podcast is because of orcs. I've talked a little bit previously in a few of these podcasts associated with my particular view with regards to Greenskins. And it comes through a variety of different factors, but the greatest component of this is an image drawn in, I think, either a 3rd or 2nd edition. I did actually find the Orc Codex that it was a part of, or Orc Rulebook that it was a part of. But my image of this comes through Games Workshop, in terms of my defining it. And that is of a mushroom growing with a little humanoid orc in the ground underneath it. And I think this description of greenskins as being fungus-grown creatures is really important. The notion is that potentially orcs don't have to eat. They actually photosynthesize, which is how they kind of grow. And, it's very curious that on one side, the mushrooms, you think of them as a kind of passive thing. On the other side, they create these great lumbering beasts. And my perspective with regards to greenskin evolution is slightly different than Tolkien. My perspective is that the orcs that are born from fungus grow, and they continue to grow, and they continue to grow. And while there is a clear demarcation in most fantasy perspectives associated with goblins and orcs, my view is that they're just different strains of the same kind of fungus, basically. And potentially there are orc teenagers that would fight with goblins, and then there are definitely elderly goblins that would fight with orcs. And the distinction between orcs and goblins is not as great. Now, I think in Tolkien explicitly, there's this notion that goblins were bred with men to create orcs. It's kind of subtle. I mean, it certainly comes up with some part of Fellowship of the Ring. But through this, you have a series of different stories associated with the origins of these things. Now, my perspective is probably there were wild goblins and orcs that existed well before human interaction. But just as humans farm wheat and tomatoes and curious things like olive trees that require extensive processing before they actually become edible things, certainly human cultivation and probably some degree of wizardry assisted the cultivation of orcs and goblins. And the connection of the two, I think, is really fascinating, that a certain group of humans, through malcontented play, for want of a better term, would ultimately create greenskins. Now, obviously, there's the notion of kind of self-seeded greenskins as well. The notion that this fungus can take over, large damp areas, perhaps caves, these kind of things. And through that, you get a wide variety of different kinds of greenskins. I am very sympathetic to the mainstream view of these creatures. And one of the things that I find really wonderful is that you can have a completely different greenskin origin story and still enjoy the vast quantity of greenskin stuff that exists in the world today. So I'm a bit of a purist associated with the imaging of them. When I say a purist, I'm post Peter Jackson's orc view, which is really prior to Peter Jackson's orc view. I like a lot of the stuff that Kev Adams did. I think Kev Adams is probably the founding father of the visualization of contemporary orcs and goblins. And he's a fascinating character. I've never met the man. I've exchanged a brief set of emails which deteriorated very rapidly with him. But I now know that there are folks like, I think the gentleman's name is Diego Certi, perhaps, who maintain constant contact and work for Kev Adams. And he's actually one of the characters that I want to talk about when I meet Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, because they found him fundamentally and put him to work. I mean, others put him to work, but he's just such a creative character in this thing associated with visualizing orcs and goblins. And certainly with the correspondence that I had with him and other things I've heard about him, he has actually spent time of his life in the world of these greenskins. Like, he's actually taking information back from various psychedelic experiences that he has had, which I think is fascinating and wonderful, and really what a lot of this deep fantasy should be about. It's interesting, actually, the role of psychedelics with Games Workshop. I've talked about this a few times in the podcast. There was a fellow called Stan the Psychedelic Man who came over from San Francisco and made miniatures out of plasticine and banana oil. And he was one of the founding, well, not founding, as terms of responsible, but he was one of the early participants in Games Workshop. And then you have the likes of Kev Adams, and you have a variety of other folk that have come through this thing. And I think a lot of the artists, particularly with regards to the description of chaos, it's like that. Anyway, I'm repeating myself here. On greenskins. So you then have the potential of a wide variety of fungusoid creatures to come out of this. You have the potential for certain kinds of trolls to ultimately be greenskins too. So from small snotling-like creatures, I guess that's what they call them in Games Workshop, and they call them nightlings in various other locations, Black Tree Design. Talk a little bit more about Black Tree Design later on in this podcast. But you have all these possibilities here in terms of where you get your, prepubescent greenskins from, and then potentially to goblins and orcs. I've never really done that in my games. Goblins as a species don't really exist in most of my games, because I think they fill an interesting kind of transitional thing. And then you have the orcs out of it. I think goblins are to orcs as dwarves are to humans, really, in some very meaningful sense. They're a kind of strange offshoot. I have various people I know who are very big in the psychedelic community that say that dwarves are Jews in Tolkien's writing. And I've never wanted that to be the case. I've always thought of them more like the Welsh. which is interesting. Like, which minority are your dwarves coming from? But goblins here are very curious in this whole hierarchy of things. Now, they fit in perfectly in Tolkien because they exist prior to the orcs and they exist simpatico with humans. And while you don't have the beautiful kind of fungusoid elements that you get through Games Workshop fundamentally, you still have a narrative where these creatures are all, you know, the link between goblins, orcs, and humans is a continuous thing. And I think this is an important part of the narrative as well. This is, I guess, how you get half-orcs, too. You have these things where it's a symbiotic relationship. That actually orcs and goblins are here because of humans. And maybe you could get the full circle. In fact, that is an interesting role-playing thing. The whole exploration of that thing. Finding the origins of the Greenskins in a variety of different ways. But then finding mysteriously, like Planet of the Apes, that they're actually some kind of return to humans as well. Many different possibilities in a role-playing game. But I wanted to record a little bit about orcs before I got into the more serious topics for this particular recording. I have here 2 books. I've received 2 books today. I knew I was going to receive them today. I kind of preemptively recorded yesterday in order to talk a little bit more today. And for the benefit of this recording, I'm just going to say I've spent about 30 minutes with each of these books. So what we are dealing with here is a very initial review. And I also want to point out, because this is incredibly important and very rarely noted, at least on YouTube, I paid my own money for these things. So this is going to be an unblinkered review. It's not like, oh, I got these freebies and, oh, let me look through them. Let's talk a little bit about this. The first I'm going to talk about is Ash Baker's Last Day Zombie Apocalypse, which is Osprey Games' rules associated with this wonderful genre of the zombie apocalypse. I appeared in a podcast called The Z Realm many, many, many years ago, talking about my own views with regards to the zombie apocalypse. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe I just recorded something about the zombie apocalypse for one of the... Anyway, my discussion of the zombie apocalypse at the time was that I thought there was a huge amount of hope in the zombie apocalypse. I look at these zombie apocalypse movies because there are always other humans out there somewhere. Whereas my perspective is always the case that you will be the last human in the zombie apocalypse. And that is a perspective on filmmaking and a variety of other things that I just want to float out there. Anyway, Last Day's Zombie Apocalypse. This is a book where you have a bunch of human miniatures, you have a bunch of zombie miniatures, and you want to play a game. And my perspective on this is that this could potentially be a game that I would run at work. I'm giving 3 options to my players. 1, well, maybe 4. I don't want to give D&D as an option. I really don't. Let's say 3 options. Definitely 3 options. You heard it here first. Last Days of the Zombie Apocalypse. A Victorian England game rule system that is yet to be determined but maybe reviewed here. And the Chechen rules. I'm giving a way out for people who don't want to necessarily play the Chechen rules. So getting Last Days Zombie Apocalypse was an important step in that direction. Let's talk a little bit about this book really quickly, going through it. I think this is very similar, actually. Very, very similar. Scarily similar, and will probably be similar enough that my co-workers will just say, why don't we just play Zombie Apocalypse, just plain chaos? This is the similarities are so great with the just plain chaos rule system. It is very similar in terms of stats, various kinds of abilities, and characters that are in that perfect kind of skirmish, you know, between role-playing and wargaming, basically. And that's what this rule system is about. It's pretty quick. It looks very easy to learn. It looks pretty fun. It is designed, well, I mean, it's at least described, associated with relatively one-dimensional skirmish scenarios. Whereas my view is I would play it as a long-form game with at least one of these an evening into a longer form, you know, don't say the N-word, longer form game, let's just call it that. So within that framework, this thing works very well, I think. It ticks all the boxes. I'm actually going to take it into work and give it to the potential players over the next few weeks and say, does this interest you? The only thing I'm debating doing is I want to also have the Victorian era rules in a similar setting. So what I will do is probably get those and look through them and offer both up to my co-workers so they will have 2 things to look through. Because that way at least, and maybe a sketch of the Chechen rules, maybe. Because that way at least they'll have 3 things to look at. And also, because I'm dealing with probably half a dozen to maybe 8 players, it'll also mean that there are things that can be passed around and looked at. Get a sense of anticipation, at least. Now, I have some zombie fingers. I have, obviously, through the Checha rules and other things, I've got a bunch of, modern day humans with guns. So, I have miniatures already that could be set up for this thing. But the other option is to use Hero Forge and have the characters create their own miniatures through Hero Forge, which is a nice way of doing that. And then base the game from that. So this is one possibility, Last Days of the Zombie Apocalypse. They have a new book coming out called Seasons, which is how I know about this at all. I'm subscribed to Wargames Illustrated free YouTube, and they had a review of Seasons, and I thought, a zombie apocalypse game, a skirmish zombie apocalypse game. This is what I'm looking for in my life currently. So I would certainly rate Last Days of the Zombie Apocalypse based on a 30-minute flip through. I think it would be relatively fun to play. It's probably ideally suited to the work game, so more on that if it becomes the selected choice. The next game that I am going to review, I'm going to move and actually pick this up physically. The joys of actually having a physical form while recording a podcast, is from Warlord Games. It is Warlords of Erehwon rulebook. Now, once again, I paid money for this rulebook, which I think probably makes it distinctly different than most of the reviews that you will ever see with regards to this game. Some pluses and some minuses. I've had 30 minutes to look through the book. I really like the fact that there are a wide variety of miniature companies that can support this game. Obviously, Warlord makes miniatures as well, but they reference a number of miniatures companies. Well, they don't reference Black Tree Design, which I think is really curious that they don't reference them. But they reference a number of other independent miniature companies, and that I've got to give a plus to. The name really sucks. I think Warlords of Erehwon is just not a name that, when you're competing against Warhammer, Age of Stigma is, let's move that aside, but, Warlords of Erehwon. Maybe just call it like Warlords, or, I don't know, Erehwon Warlords, or I don't know, or simplify it down. I was thinking about this just with regards to, obviously you've got all your kind of undead. There are gnolls in here, halfling armies. Anyway, there are all these bits and pieces here. I understand the notion of trademarks and that you want to make something relative, but maybe just a one-syllable Warlords, like a Warlords of The book, I think, it's too heavy. This strikes me as a rule set that would be best serviced by 4 rule books. The core rule book, a book associated with magic and other items which are optional, a set of army books perhaps, or maybe just an army book, and then finally the book of encounters or, games from it. To put this all in one book makes sense in some regard in terms of from, Warlord Games perspective, just sell an expensive, heavy book. But practically, it doesn't need to be this way. This could be 4 manageable books of which you would ever need to take 2, maybe 3 at a pinch to a game. Maybe just 1, really. One, your stat sheet for your army. That's it, right? Magical items you can put in your stat sheet for your army. So I think it's just heavy. And that, in and of itself, is annoying. It's done by, it's a Rick Priestley book. So it's interesting. I don't think Rick Priestley is responsible for the bolt action rule system. So it's like Rick Priestley meets bolt action in fantasy, which has a lot of really interesting things. But by necessity now, maybe even when he was with Games Workshop, maybe I'm looking at Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, one of his defining books. There's a verbosity to it which I think is pretty unnecessary at this stage. My view is, of the market, 5 to 10% of the market is going to never have played one of these games before. The rest have. And that should change the way you write rules, fundamentally. Or at least change the way you publish rules. And what strikes me about this is a thick rule system for the sake of being a thick rule system. There's very limited aspects to this that merits the verbosity that I've seen so far. I've not actually played the game yet, so this is just an outlier. I really love the fact that this enables a variety of different miniature manufacturers to be played on the tabletop. And it's interesting because you look at this rule system, you're like, why isn't there, why aren't there actual factions associated with these things? Why can't I buy, a barbarian army or a halfling army or these kind of things just off the shelf? I mean, it's Warlord after all, right? But then reading the rule system and getting a sense of the many, many, many miniature manufacturers. I mean, they listed maybe a dozen miniature manufacturers, maybe 8 to a dozen. But practically, there are so many miniature manufacturers that could easily fit in with this rule system. I think it's a good thing in this space. And it's an interesting space because obviously once, Warhammer Fantasy became Age of Stigma, then, that's a different thing, right? It's round-based skirmish fantasy, what have you. And this doesn't really touch, actually. The bases, actually, I think, are all round here, too. Yeah, some square-based, some round-based. So there's definitely a mixture here. And if I'd read the rules more thoroughly, I'd probably be able to tell you immediately the distinction between those two things. So, yes, I looked at it in terms of a replacement for square-based fantasy. And I think what's interesting through this is the I go, you go mechanic is removed based on action dice, which you reach out of a sack. So it's the bolt action mechanic there, which I think is incredibly refreshing. And to be perfectly frank, in general terms, even though I've been critical of certain aspects, I think this is really exciting. It actually made me feel a lot better flicking through it than I had by watching the potted YouTube commercials, which are always independently done, that came out about this thing. So yes, this might actually be something that I feel positive about, heaven forbid. I, by chance yesterday, found the most recent White Dwarf, which goes through in elaborate detail in, I think, maybe a 3 or 4 page spread. Games Workshop now actively recruits independent reviewers for their rule system. And I think it was a fascinating read. I mean, this is Warhammer 40,000 fundamentally, but this is very much the tournament player mentality. So they went to Nova, and it's funny, I, by chance, met a few of the original folks that created Nova last year. I was meeting a miniature painter in Maryland while I was there, and he was staying in a house with a bunch of folks that had created Nova. I think the mother of the creator was the person's house it was. Anyway, so he's one of these people. Carl Turtle, who's local to me, he works at Yahoo, actually. I've never met Carl. We go to a number of the same game shops, and his podcast, The Independent Characters, is a flagship Warhammer 40,000, not necessarily hardcore tournament play, more friendly play, actually. I do like Carl's style. Certainly, I've listened to his podcast periodically. It's just not me, really, but I do like the notion that he is not really hardcore tournament. He's kind of friendly game first, but also he lives in his grandmother's house. And in the San Francisco Bay Area, the salaries are high, but the cost of living is higher. And whenever you find these people that live in these inherited houses, they basically have on the table $50,000 plus more a year than most of us have. So he is living in that dream, right? High income, low cost of living, expensive hobby. So there is that element to his podcast, which is the bit that I found a little bit wearing. You might say, hey, Tom, you're sending miniatures out to be painted at an alarmingly large rate. If you actually saw what it was on paper, it would not be quite as overwhelming as you might originally think. Anyway, so Carl is an interesting character. He was in there. The fellow, I think his name is Devon, perhaps, who runs Frontline Painting is another one. So already these are 3 folks that I have one degree of separation from in some meaningful sense. The Frontline Painting guy, his offsider Jason, is the guy that I correspond with my miniature painters, and they've made quite a successful business out of this whole thing. So these are 3 of however many, 5 articles, maybe 5 or 6, that are now actively working with Games Workshop to provide independent rules reviews associated with tournament play primarily. And it's a fascinating read of the direction that this corporation is going in terms of finding people in a community and utilising them. They fly them to Nottingham. So, heading into Nottingham, play a few of the new rules games, give feedback. I'm not sure I think the NDAs don't allow them to take the rules back and play them locally with their friends. But yeah, it is very interesting, this notion of playtesting, where this corporation is bringing people in now, which they should have been doing 20 years ago. Don't think in any way, shape or form I'm being negative with regards to this thing. I think for Games Workshop to reach out to clearly, tall poppies in the sphere of tournament play and just this thing is really, really smart. And I think the people they've picked here are clearly best in class associated with that. I just found it a fascinating read because I'm like, interesting. These are the people now that are providing additional feedback. And truth be told, the new editor of White Dwarf is from Privateer Press. I mean, they're now actively recruiting outside their comfort zone to create a new thing. And that will be very interesting to follow. It's fascinating to me to actually watch. I mean, it's interesting to get in the magazine because I'm like, I'm not really interested in any of these games. I mean, the only game that has any kind of continuing interest for me, and even that is very curious, is Warhammer 40,000. The other games have gone in completely different directions. I mean, Necromunda, I kind of like. But, the other games have gone in completely different directions. It's interesting going back, doing full circle, actually, with this podcast. Rewatching The Lord of the Rings makes me a lot more sympathetic to the strategy game. So, would I become a Lord of the Rings player? Who knows at this stage. But I've got these figures to be painted, So, maybe. Anyway, I hope that you have enjoyed this longer podcast, going in a few different directions, but ultimately giving a bit more content to you, my long-suffering listeners. If you want to get in contact with me, my email address is my surname, barbelay@gmail.com, Bravo Alpha Romeo, Bravo Alpha Lima Echo Tango. I'm going to be talking with Barney Dicker sometime in the near future. If you too would like to participate in this thing, I have no concerns with regards to talking to absolutely anyone. So please do get in contact. I'll set up a recording time. We can have a chat. You can throw some ideas out. We can jam with regards to the N-word. And yeah, it'll become a thing. It'll become a podcast in a feed. Tom Barbalet in the San Francisco Bay Area, signing out.